Paul was in Mars Hill, and there was the two basic practical philosophies that had survived. All the other philosophies had not been useful. There's just Epicureans and Stoics, and it always devolves into that. It just is going to be Epicurean, avoid pain, seize pleasure, or Stoicism, endure pain for virtue. And that's it. That's like the best that our kind of philosophies can get to. And so we live in an Epicurean culture. Avoid pain, pursue pleasure. It defines our policies. It defines all the talking points of the democratic policy platforms. I mean, it's just, it defines our culture, this obsession with pleasure, avoiding pain. I mean, abortion, it's all Epicurean arguments. Euthanasia, Epicurean arguments. A legalized, all the kind of licentious culture, it's all Epicurean. So now we have a sort of predictable rise in Stoicism, which is why I kind of reacted to the virtue talk, because there's a Christian understanding of virtue, but there's a Stoic understanding of virtue, which is not a Christian understanding. Now it's adjacent to Christianity, right? It's not a complete stranger like Epicureanism is. We'd be friends with the Stoics, but it's a different thing. And this is one of the ways to see the differences, is that Stoics are counting down the days till you die. Christians are treasuring every day that you live. Stoics, and here's another place that it comes in. The Stoics would say that you endure suffering for the sake of goodness or virtue. The Christian says that you rejoice in suffering. Jesus, in the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when you're persecuted, when you're mistreated, rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Paul says in Romans chapter 5, we rejoice in our suffering. James says, first, count it all joy when you endure various trials of various kinds. Peter says it in his 6 counsels in suffering in 1 Peter. He 3 times says that we rejoice. It's not just and that's the difference. It's not just enduring suffering, but it's a joy in the midst of suffering. And that is a completely different kind of attitude and a completely different kind of life. It's not just that we're willing to suffer things because we know they're coming to an end, because we know it makes us stronger, because we know there's benefit in it, because we know that it comes from the Lord's hands, and He's our Heavenly Father, and He gives us everything good. But there is an even deeper sense that everything is coming to me through the wounds of Jesus. And so that even every moment of suffering is an undeserved moment of God's grace. And so that, it's just a completely different
It is, yeah.
way of
You're making me think of, have you read C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress?
I have, but
okay.
I
read it recently.
20 years ago.
Yeah. And when I read it again the second time, I was like, I forgot everything, right? But one of the things that stood out to me was, so Lewis's character is kind of going through, it's kind of like a Dante, a little bit, where he's kind of, The Great Divorce is a little more Dante. But he's kind of traveling through, and he kind of meets all these different ideologies, and he plays this out in this kind of fictional format. But then one of his good friends throughout is virtue. And so he travels with virtue, and he's got kind of this north-south, and the north, it's exactly what you're talking about. So the north is kind of Platonic thought or Stoicism, and then the south is Epicureanism. So they spend most of their time traveling north. And they go to the very north, and there's this giant there. And it's kind of representing the Norse gods. And he basically says that the Norse cultures were kind of the most stoic. And it ended up taking on this very combative idea where your job is to kind of defeat weakness, both in yourself, but also in actual military conquest. So virtue really latches onto this giant on the uttermost north, right? And he's interested in kind of going on these conquests. And then in the end, virtue then goes blind. And then Lewis has to drag virtue rest of the way. Wow. And in the end, the big turnaround, which is kind of why it's a regress versus Bunyan's progress, is it's this big climactic moment where he has to take virtue. They have to jump off this cliff down into this water and then go down through these water tunnels and out the other end. And then they have to then the whole story gets reversed, right? But it's this whole baptismal thing, right? That he has to, all of this has to be willing to die. And I don't fully understand it, but it's very much exactly what you're saying is what he paints out in that story.
Well, it's like the best part of us, which is the part that's good
Hmm.
and brave and virtuous and chaste and sacrificing for the neighbor, is the most dangerous part of us,
Hmm.
because it's the part that we are most tempted to trust in.
Mm.
Which is why, I mean, this is why it's important to be Lutheran. This is why hardly anybody is. This is why the Reformation was important. Is that this hardest part of the gospel is that our good works are dangerous.
Mm.
Now, it doesn't mean that they're not necessary,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean that they're not good, but that they're dangerous, because more than anything else, I mean, we want to trust in ourselves. We want to trust in our wealth. We want to trust in our whatever, but more than anything else, we want to trust in our goodness
Hmm.
to please God. And that is the most offensive thing.
Hmm.
So that our good works we have to understand as dirty rags. So that it makes sense to me that virtue at last, I mean, it's not an accident that pride is the worst of all sins, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because it is idolatry. It puts ourselves in the place of God. It makes God into an apple god. But it's um uh that doesn't mean we don't pursue goodness and love for the sake of the neighbor, but we recognize that it's always going to be dangerous, because there's that little, what Luther called the little monk that lives inside of each of us,
Mm.
or the little Pharisee that lives in the flesh. That doesn't just say, "Hey, I I want to go do bad stuff," but that little Pharisee says, "Hey, I want to go do good stuff,
Hmm.
so that God will be happy with me."
Hmm.